Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of history's quietest little after-parties. The one that happens after the king dies. So get comfortable, dim the lights, maybe pour some tea, and let's drift into the strange, twilight lives of royal mistresses. The women who for a time ruled the hearts of kings, and then, well, mostly got very bad retirement packages. Because, here's the thing, being a mistress to a monarch wasn't exactly a safe or even glamorous job. Sure, there were gowns, jewels, titles, and that brief golden age of power when everyone bowed and scraped and said Madame like ye were a demi. But the clock always ticked toward one inevitable moment, when His Majesty stopped breathing and the court started cleaning house. Let's float back a few centuries. Velvet gowns, powdered wigs, the faint smell of candle wax and court intrigue, and somewhere in the corner of every palace ballroom, there's her. The king's favorite. Smiling, polished, perfectly aware that every glance from a noblewoman hides envy, and every whisper hides her expiration date. When kings died, queens became widows, mistresses became liabilities, and that's where our story begins. The rise and vanish of Madame de Pompadour first. Stop, France. Naturally, because 18th century France basically wrote the handbook on how to have mistresses with dignity, architecture, and personalized china sets. Jean Antoinette Poisson, better known as Madame de Pompadour, was Louis XV's most famous companion. She wasn't born noble. She was born clever, which was much rarer at Versailles. She could charm a priest and manipulate a minister before breakfast. Louis adored her for more than her looks. She was witty, cultured, and, most dangerously, capable of running a king like a well-oiled machine. But death, as always, ruins the pacing. When Louis XV began to age, and his health collapsed, Pompadour was still very much around, organizing his entertainments like a patient executive assistant with diamonds. The tragedy, if you can call it that, is she didn't live long enough to face the widow's cliff. She died 4 years before him, still officially the royal favorite, which is about as peaceful an ending as history ever gives to women in her role. Even then, the royal court, which had adored her jewels but despised her power, didn't quite know what to do when her coffin left Versailles. Louis reportedly watched it go and said, "There goes the only friend I ever had," which for a man surrounded by courtiers is both sweet and devastatingly accurate. So, Pompadour in death managed to do the impossible. She preempted royal widowhood. She slipped away before the political guillotine started swinging. But not every mistress was that lucky. Let's glide to the next century. Same country, much less candlelight, much more chaos. The ghost of Madame du Barry. Remember Madame du Barry? Yes, the last great mistress of the French monarchy. Louis XV's midlife crisis, wrapped in lace and diamonds, she became a symbol of royal decadence. Right before the French Revolution politely suggested that maybe everyone should stop beheading cakes and start beheading people instead. When the king died, du Barry's whole world evaporated overnight. The courtiers who'd once fawned over her simply vanished. The new King Louis XVI and his famously unimpressed wife, Marie Antoinette, preferred their mistresses imaginary, which is to say non-existent. So, du Barry was politely escorted out of Versailles, stripped of influence and left to fade into gossip column. Oblivion, and in fairness, she tried to adapt. She moved to a quiet chateau, collected art, tried vegetarianism. Kidding, it was still 18th century France, and lived a calm, ornamental life. But when the revolution actually struck, former mistresses of kings were not considered charming widows. They were symbols of everything wrong with France. Du Barry was arrested, accused of treason, and you know where this is going, executed in 1793. Her crime, loving a dead king too publicly and owning too many diamonds while the people starved. So her afterlife wasn't exactly a warm bath in a book. BT's point. You can see the pattern forming. The king dies, everyone panics, and the mistress suddenly has to discover what normal life even means when your entire identity was built on smiling from the gilded second row of power. Let's float north to mistier, moodier lands. Barbara Villiers, The post-love disaster of England, it's the Restoration period. Wigs taller than bread loaves, moral hypocrisy, reaching record highs, and King Charles II of England, who frankly made sleeping around his only real public policy. Out of all his mistresses, Barbara Villiers, the Duchess of Cleveland, was the absolute chaos queen. Beautiful, manipulative, politically savvy, and angry that the crown didn't physically fit on her head. For a time, she was the most powerful woman in England, until Charles got bored, which was inevitable, given his attention span. When Charles II died in 1685, Barbara was still alive, still wealthy, but politically radioactive. The new king, James II, couldn't stand her, and the court, which once groveled for her approval, pretended they'd never met her. So Barbara did the only logical thing. She moved to France, took new lovers, and spent her fortune in spectacular, unapologetic style. She died in 1709, obscure, overweight, and still scandalous, a minor newspaper gossip item rather than a royal headline. If Pompadour died mid-glory and Du Barry died on the scaffold, Barbara Villiers simply outlived her own myth, which, somehow, feels the loneliest of all. But not every royal mistress was left to fend for herself entirely. Some queens, perhaps out of genuine kindness, or perhaps convenient optics, kept the women close, which brings us to one of the strangest friendships in royal history. The widow and the mistress in Prussian, 18th century Prussia, there was King Frederick William II, a man who managed to be both musically gifted and extremely bad at personal discipline. His mistress Wilhelmine, in qui later ennobled as Countess Lictino, was more or less his emotional crutch, intelligent, cultured, practically running court life from behind the drapes. When Frederick William died, everyone expected the new King Frederick, William III, to banish her immediately. Instead, she was treated with gentleness, given a pension, even allowed to keep some of her property. It helped that she kept receipts, every letter, every favor, every royal promise, carefully archived. The Prussian state, ever bureaucratic even in its personal scandals, considered it simpler to pay her off than to provoke another court-whispering campaign. She lived quietly to old age, painting and gossiping in respectable middle-class comfort. Not quite tragic, not quite glamorous, just an which, in royal mistress terms, is practically a happily ever after. Let's drift from bureaucratic Berlin to perfumed London again, where the Georges were doing their best to make domestic chaos look hereditary. The sad freedom of Lady Conyngham. The early 19th century, when King George IV of Britain took the throne, the role of royal mistress was unofficially official. Society knew it, tolerated it, and occasionally mocked it. Elizabeth Conyngham was his final great love, a tall, elegant Irish woman with ambitions politely disguised as sincerity. George adored her, showered her with jewels, and ignored the fact that her husband was often in the same room, because that was how etiquette worked. If you didn't acknowledge the scandal, it didn't exist. When George IV died in 1830, Coningham's reputation instantly curdled. The public despised her, calling her greedy and vulgar. Politicians made sure she lost access to royal favors. Her fortune mostly came from gifts the late king had given her, and many were quietly taken back by the crown after his death. She retreated to her estate, becoming a ghost of fashion, surrounded by dusty portraits and unreturned invitations. If you think about it, there's something almost gothic in that image. Love letters yellowing beside unopened boxes of jewelry. The great lady who once outshone duchesses, now wandering her garden like an unpaid bill. Royal mistress didn't fade because they lost their power. They faded because their existence depended on the life of one man. And once that thread was cut, so was the story. Let's float quietly. Spain, now where court decorum and Catholic guilt made royal affairs a bit more theatrical. The elegantly exiled Duchess of Alba. Forward to the late 18th century again. But this time, it's Madrid. Maria Teresa Cayetana de Silva, the 13th Duchess of Alba, was one of the most magnetic women in Europe. She was a friend and rumored lover of King Charles IV, though famously it was his wife's favorite painter, Francisco Goya, who immortalized her. When the Queen Maria Louisa suspected there was more between the Duchess and the King than formal courtesies, the Duchess was sent away politely, of course, but unmistakably, exile in her own country. She spent her later years at her estate in Andalusia, hosting smaller salons, growing eccentric and increasingly obsessed with folk culture, a way of asserting her identity, outside of the suffocating formality of court life. And when she died in her 40s, unexpectedly, whispers filled Madrid again. Poison, heartbreak, divine punishment. History, as usual, looked away. But Goya didn't he? He kept painting her, or at least, painting spirits that looked suspiciously like her long after she was gone. Which, in a strange way, means she didn't quite disappear. She lived on, in art. Pigment replacing perfume. Let's pause here for a breath. This is often the quiet midpoint in their stories. It's almost formulaic. Rise, glitter loss, and then ... Stillness. The stillness where the world stops talking about them, but their portraits keep staring, down from museum walls. That's how the first arc of our story ends tonight. The gentle unraveling of women who once helped run empires from behind curtains and now rest like forgotten notes in gilded margins. Next time, we'll drift further east to Russia, where imperial mistresses weren't just ornaments, but sometimes power brokers, until they too met the final frost. Welcome, Bach Wanderer of Forgotten Scandals. If you're still awake, congratulations, or possibly condolences, because now we drift into colder courts, both in temperature and temperament. In France and England, mistresses were expected accessories, like powdered wigs or moral hypocrisy, but in Eastern Europe, the atmosphere was sharper, more unpredictable. Mistresses weren't ornaments. They were tools of politics, survival, or sometimes revenge. When the king died, Western mistresses might fade quietly. In the East, they vanished faster, sometimes into convent, sometimes into history's footnotes, sometimes into rather serious accidents. So let us wrap a fur cloak around our imagination and step into Russia, where love affairs were national policy and exile was a lifestyle. The ice-bound afterlife of Catherine, you might think Catherine the First, but she became empress. Yes, and that's the point. She was the exception that proved the rule. Before she wore the crown of Russia, Marta Helena Skowronska was just a Lithuanian village girl, taken as a war prisoner. Somehow, through what can only be described as historical improvisation, she caught the attention of Peter the Great, the 6'7" emperor who built St. Petersburg, modernized Russia, and destroyed most people's sleep schedules. She became his mistress, then his wife. And finally, after his death in 1725, the empress in her own right, which sounds romantic until you realize she lasted only 2 years before dying of illness and exhaustion from trying to keep Peter's crumbling empire together. After her death, everyone at court quietly rewrote her story, calling her a devoted nurse to the state, which is one of those backhanded ways historians tell you someone was supposed to have power in the first place, but still she escaped the traditional mistress fate. She went from mistress to monarch, which, if this were a fairy tale, would sound triumphant. In reality, it was just the briefest mirage of victory before another imperial faction replaced her memory entirely. Let us drift forward a few generations to women who weren't quite as lucky when the Tsars died. Countess Vorontsova, the Tsar's secret. Then his widow's problem. Fast forward to Nicholas I, Emperor of Russia in the early to mid-1800s. He was tall, disciplined, terrifyingly proper, until he wasn't. Enter Countess Barbara Alexeyevna Nelidova, who started as a lady-in-waiting and quietly became his lifelong emotional refuge. She wasn't scandalous like French mistresses, just calm, nurturing, and heartbreakingly patient. Everyone at court knew, but etiquette demanded silence. When Nicholas died, suddenly in 1855, the Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna chose the higher road, by which I mean she exiled Barbara discreetly rather than publicly shaming her. The Countess was allowed to retire quietly to a monastery estate, effectively vanishing from society. In one of those darkly poetic historical footnotes, Her letters were later burned by her own family to preserve dignity, which, of course, erased her entirely. It's oddly fitting. In the Empire of Snow and Secrets, the mistress of a dead Tsar didn't die publicly. She simply dissolved, like frozen air under spring sun. Let's sail south now, toward the glittering, uncertain courts of Austria, where the Habsburgs made hereditary melancholy an art form. The lonely rooms of Katharina Schratt meet. Katharina Schratt, actress turned semi-official companion of Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria. Officially, she wasn't a mistress. Unofficially, she was precisely that, but politely, tastefully, Viennese about it. Franz Joseph adored her conversational calm. She soothed him while his formidable wife, Empress Elizabeth Ceci, roamed Europe escaping both protocol and depression. Schratt became the emperor's emotional safety net, serving tea, offering sympathy, and pretending that being perpetually invisible was fulfilling. After Ceci's assassination and then Franz Joseph's death in 1916, Vienna collapsed under war, monarchy, and melancholy. Schratt stayed quietly in her house, living alone through the empire's ruin. She died in 1940. Yes, still alive during World War II in near poverty, surrounded by decades of letters she'd carefully refused to publish. Her story wasn't tragic in the headline sense. It was just small, prolonged sadness, the kind that lingers in wallpaper and worn velvet chairs. The Spanish widow who never was Let's Float. Again, to warmer climates Spain in the late 19th century. King Alfonso XII was married, yes, but royal duty rarely competes well with human impulse. His mistress, Alina Sanz, was a celebrated opera singer, independent, sharp-eyed, and inconveniently better liked by the public than the queen herself. Alfonso had 2 illegitimate sons with her, a minor problem for royal image-making in a Catholic monarchy. When he died young, at just 27, Elena found herself suddenly very uninvited at court functions. His widow, Queen Maria Cristina, made sure no record of Elena's relationship remained in official memory. Sanz was exiled from respectable society, forced onto small concert tours to survive the glamorous woman reduced to earning applause to afford rent. She died in poverty in 1898. Her sons, though recognized privately, never gained legitimate positions. History filed her away as a curiosity. Even her voice, once loved by kings, survived only as a rumor. The pattern repeats like a lullaby of slow erasure. The man dies, the woman becomes myth, then myth fades to whisper. And yet, sometimes, the public refuses to forget. Let's move slightly forward to the early 20th century, when royal mistresses were finally appearing in newspapers instead of poetry. Alice Keppel and the Art of Graceful Exit by King Edward VII ruled Britain after waiting an eternity as Prince of Wales. The entire nation basically accepted he had mistresses, plural. His final and favorite was Alice Keppel, a society beauty with a skill set of a modern PR agent. Charming, discreet, and very good at making even adulteries seem respectable. When Edward died in 1910, the royal family handled it awkwardly. King George V, his son, quietly instructed her to leave the palace before the press arrived, which she did gracefully, leaving a bunch of flowers on her dressing table. She never complained publicly, never wrote memoirs, never cashed in on the scandal. She just left, the ultimate dignified fade-out. Her descendants, though, had a peculiar afterglow. One of them, Camilla Parker Bowles, would much later become queen consort to another Charles in another century. History, as it turns out, really does recycle roles. Still, Alice's exit shows the evolution by the 20th century. Royal mistresses learned to control their own vanishing, to retreat, before being Gabrielle d'Estrées, the Eternal. Almost Queen of France now. Let's circle back to where this all began. France again, golden candlelight flickering on silks. Centuries before Pompadour and Dubarry, there was Gabrielle d'Estrées, mistress to Henry IV of France. Unlike most, she wasn't ruined by scandal. She was loved. Deeply. Henry wanted to marry her, even began the paperwork to annul his first marriage. But before anything could happen, Gabrielle suddenly fell ill and died while pregnant in 1599. just days before their union was to be declared valid. Henry was devastated. He called her his true wife and ordered mourning for her across France. She was buried royally, but never crowned. A mistress forever on the brink of legitimacy, frozen in a portrait where she sits in a bath, smiling faintly, as her sister pinches her nipple. Yes, that one, in one of art history's most quietly infamous scenes. Centuries later, that same expression, soft, smiling, almost smug, feels like the perfect symbol of royal mistresses in general. Almost queens. Almost wives. Almost remembered. Thematic drift. The vanishing act as we move along the slow current of time. You start noticing something hypnotic in these patterns. They all followed the same rhythm. Rise, radiance, oblivion. Royal mistresses were like comets. They flared bright in a king's reign, then disappeared into cold space when he was gone. Some hit convent walls, others artistic immortality, others just tax trouble. But collectively, they show the most human side of monarchy, longing, vanity, compromise, and the strange fragility of borrowed glory. When kings died, the courtiers bowed to a coffin. The queens wept dutifully, but somewhere behind the curtains, a woman quietly packed her trunks, took one last look at the portraits, and wondered who she was now that no one called her Madame. Because every mistress eventually faced the same silent question, who are you when the power is gone? For some, like Pompadour, death came mercifully early. For others, like Shret or Cunningham, old age dragged it out day after day of being politely forgotten, which, in this strange, sleepy way, is maybe why we still remember them. They're ghosts that never quite left the palace, lingering not out of vengeance, but unfinished conversation. Let's slowly fade now toward the twilight of monarchies, the 20th century, where empires cracked open and mistresses turned into just companions, socialites, sometimes even friends of the family. But before we cross that line, take another breath. Somewhere out there, another lonely portrait still hangs, another woman's half-smile watching centuries drift by, waiting to be noticed one more time before we move on. Welcome back again, listener. In Half Dream. By now, we've drifted through centuries of powdered scandal. The Pompadours, Thidubaris, the quietly exiled countesses who all learned the same bedtime moral, never outlive your king. But as the 20th century rolled in, things started to change. The world industrialized. Monarchies modernized, and the idea of a state-sponsored romantic city quest became slightly less fashionable, or at least less well-funded. In the fading world of empires, royal mistresses didn't vanish overnight. They just turned into something softer, something more like companions, friends, or people we absolutely are not writing about in newspapers. Thank you very much. So tonight, let's float through that final, smoky century, the one where kings hid their scandals behind velvet curtains, and the cameras outside were finally sharp enough to notice. The woman who waited a lifetime, Alice Keppel's second actui. Ulrich met Alice Keppel, the ultimate Edwardian mistress handling royal love affairs, with the calm of a boarding school headmistress, and the manners of a saint who owned too many hats. After Edward VII's death, she did exactly what every textbook advises. She retired quietly, bought a villa in Florence, and pretended she'd never heard of the British royal family. But time has a peculiar sense of humor, because decades later, her great-granddaughter, Camilla Parker Bowles, would end up playing the exact same role in history. This time in front of television cameras. Alice's fade into gentle Italian exile feels almost symbolic. The end of one era, lingering faintly in the next. By the time she died in 1947, the world had changed so much that even being royal seemed passe, let alone being someone's unofficial companion. The age of coronets and powdered discretion was over. Up next came microphones, tabloids, and transatlantic accents. Wallis Simpson, the mistress who became history itself. This whole lineage of secret royal companions had a grand finale. It was Wallis Simpson, an American socialite, whose middle name may as well have been Problem. When King Edward VIII of Britain met her, he wasn't just infatuated, he was obsessed. Unlike the mistresses before her, Wallis wasn't a quiet figure behind the throne. She was loud, fashionable, divorced, and absolutely unwilling to disappear politely when the crown got inconvenient. When Edward abdicated in 1936 to marry her, declaring he couldn't leave Witove, the woman I love, it ended the 1,000-year tradition of sanctioned secret mistresses in one spectacular explosion of public emotion. He gave up the throne. She gave up privacy. And together, they spent the rest of their lives as very expensive exiles, wandering through palaces that weren't really theirs, at parties hosted by people who smiled a little too politely. After his death, Valise lived another 14 years, slowly fading into isolation in Paris. Her voice grew frail, her circle shrank, and even then, she wasn't considered queen. Just the woman who changed everything. If the royal mistress story had always been one of vanishing after death, Wallace's twist was that she outlived the myth, trapped in it until the end. The forgotten faces behind the dictators stepping away from royalty for a second because by mid-century, emperors were mostly unemployed. Another type of official mistress emerged. Politicians, generals, dictators, not kings exactly, but men who behaved like them, and their companions inherited the same map of devotion and silence. There was Clara Petacci, Mussolini's much younger mistress, who followed him until the bitter end. Literally, when he was captured and executed in 1945, she refused to leave him and was executed alongside him. In a morbid way, she became what none of the royal mistresses ever did, the consort in death as well as life. In contrast, Eva Braun, Hitler's mistress, lived almost entirely in the shadows, known by a handful of aides and photographers. Never given official acknowledgement until her marriage, which lasted roughly 40 hours, ending in a suicide pact. These women weren't the playful ornaments of decadence like Dubarry or Pompadour. They were parts of regimes, symbols of devotion that blurred love and propaganda. By this stage of history, the old royal pattern had reversed. No longer glamorous mistresses erased by queens, but secret lovers erased by nations. Let's drift back to monarchies, though. The point of this long, sleepy journey, ISNT, to sprint through tragedy. It is too. Notice how power keeps the same rhythm, no matter the decade. The shifting shadows of the post-war kings after World War II, surviving monarchies did something they hadn't done in centuries. They started pretending to be monogamous, not necessarily being monogamous, pretending convincingly enough for cameras. The British royal family was suddenly a brand. The Scandinavian royals leaned into wholesome modernity. The Spanish kings tried subtlety, some more successfully than others. Yet even then the mistress never truly vanished. She just rebranded herself as the friend, the confidant, the companion. Queen Elizabeth II's cousin, Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark, was surrounded by rumors of close friendships with actresses, ballet dancers, and aristocrats. Nothing ever confirmed. Everything politely invisible. After all, the post-war world couldn't afford another abdication scandal. And yet, beneath the surface, the story never really changed. When the powerful man dies, the woman in the shadow suddenly loses both purpose and position. Still, the endings became gentler. Instead of exile, there were inheritances. Instead of execution, tabloid interviews. If we're honest, humanity didn't able be much, just got better lighting. The unintentional ghosts, modern companions to modern monarchs. It's easy to think that in our screenlit century, those stories belong entirely to the past. But the truth is, royal mistresses evolved right alongside airplanes and smartphones. They just became better at surviving public curiosity. In Spain, rumors swirled for decades around King Juan Carlos I, whose personal life eventually contributed to his abdication. The scandals weren't whispered under chandeliers, but tweeted in real time. His former companion, Karina Larson, ended up giving televised interviews about their relationship, the modern equivalent of publishing love letters to the Daily Mail. In Jordan, Morocco, Monaco, and beyond, rumors still flicker now and then, hints that the old structure persists quietly beneath the sleek Instagram posts. The power imbalance remains. Only the audience changed. Today, being the lover of a king doesn't automatically mean palaces or exile. Sometimes it just means private jets and lawyers. A modern twist on the same old script, but the emotional pattern, the dependence, the slow erasure, the delicate balancing act between affection and utility. That's still hauntingly familiar. As always, the story ends at the same place. He dies, she fades. The public forgets, the portraits stay. Why they still haunt us so? Why, you might wonder. Are we still whispering about them? These women who lived and vanished centuries ago, in satin or seclusion, because they were the human cracks in divine institutions, the moments when thrones looked almost accidentally vulnerable. You see, the mistress isn't just a scandal. She's the emotional footnote in every story about power, a reminder that even when people wear crowns, their hearts operate on something far less strategic. Pompadour could, quote, Voltaire. Villiers could blackmail ministers. Charette could soothe emperors. And Valise could topple a crown. Each, in her quiet way, shifted history, not through rebellion, but through proximity. They don't belong to romance, really. They belong to atmosphere, the perfume of influence, the echo of laughter down polished corridors, the sense that behind every royal decree there's probably someone saying, "Perhaps, darling, not today." That's their real legacy. Not jewels, not titles, just the faint trace of personality, powerful enough to tilt a monarchy by a few degrees. And yet, for all that significance, they were destined to become bedtime stories, softly told, barely remembered. The slow fade into silence by the turn of the 21st century, royal love lives became PR-managed fairy tales. Modern monarchies market family values now. They need adorable heirs and philanthropic foundations, not whispered scandals. The royal mistress, the original influencer of policy through charm, doze, and tea, fit neatly into televised coronations. So she lingers only in museums, biographies, and the occasional late-night history podcast. If she still exists, she's unnamed, invisible by design, no longer the subject of portraits, only in... It's ironic, really. The earliest mistresses were erased because they were too visible. The latest are erased because invisibility is the only survival strategy left. Let's drift back for a moment, though, to that candlelit Versailles chamber, or the echoing marble hall of Hofburg Palace. Imagine them again, perfectly composed, perfectly doomed. They knew exactly how temporary everything was, and still they played their part. There's something hauntingly brave about that. Every age loves to call them frivolous, manipulative, shallow. But tell me, how frivolous do you have to be to survive the most public kind of intimacy under the constant threat of disgrace and still leave your fingerprint on history? They played chess with destiny, and though they lost the board, they managed to leave lipstick on the king's signature. The dream closing so. As we close tonight's long drift through perfumed history, imagine yourself standing in one of those deserted royal bedrooms, the kind with faded tapestries, silent clocks, and portraits that watch you back. Somewhere beyond the curtain, carriages rattle away. The king is gone. The court is whispering elsewhere. And there, in the half-light, is a woman folding her silk gown carefully into a trunk. Her eyes are tired. Bater smayor, that small, sly, unbreakable smile, remains. She knows that history will forget her name, but never the kind of power she embodied. That strange alchemy of affection and influence. She was not queen, not wife, not servant. She was the quiet center of a chaos that only looked like love. And that's what happened to royal mistresses after the king died. Not fire, not glory, just silence. Elegant, echoing silence. Hey again, still awake. Impressive. You've officially outlasted most monarchs, and probably every royal mistress we've mentioned tonight. So let's just sink into the last stretch. A slow exhale through history, as half-lit corridors, where memory and modern imagination quietly overlap. See, the story doesn't properly end, does it? Not really. The mistresses of kings may have vanished from palace records, but strangely enough, they keep reappearing in paintings, in films, in miniseries, with candlelight filters and endlessly dramatic violins. We keep resurrecting them, softening the tragedy, glamorizing the loneliness, adding just enough eyeliner to make exile look cinematic. Because the truth is, we don't really like happy monarchies. We like broken ones that look beautiful in ruin. And nothing breaks quite as elegantly as a love that was never officially allowed. Take modern storytelling. Catherine the Great, for instance, she was once a rumor-written scandal of her own. Now reborn as streaming Serbi satire, Madame de Pompadour got museum retrospectives and luxury perfume campaigns. Even poor Madame du Barry got her redemption arc in fashion editorials. Every century, we reach back to these women, polish their pain till it glitters, then set it back on the shelf labeled romantic tragedy. But underneath the slow music and lace, the real story sits quietly unimpressed. It wasn't glamorous to be loved by a king. It was exhausting, sometimes humiliating, and often fatal to your social calendar. If you stripped away the gold dust, what they all shared was something simpler. They were ordinary people who became reflections of powerful men's fragility. They saw every king unguarded, feverish, afraid, human. That's the kind of knowledge no historian can footnote properly, and maybe that's why, even centuries later, they still haunt the culture, not as villains, not as saints, but as symbols of the parts of history that felt too intimate to discuss. Think of all the retellings we've built around them, in every lavish costume drama, every candlelit scene with conspiratorial glances and tragic foreshadowing. We really whispering the same lullaby that beauty and power never sleep peacefully side by side. History books tried to file them under appendices, but pop culture made them eternal. They went from erased names to archetypes, the clever enchantress, the fragile muse, the tragic, romantic. Each reduction says more about us than it does about them. Because, honestly, the more equal our age pretends to be, the more fascinated we become by eras that weren't. Maybe that's why late-night historians like me keep telling their stories in a tone that feels half apology, half insomnia. If you listen closely, every one of their stories hums the same refrain. Once there was a woman who thought love could outlast history, and history disagreed. But even though history won, love left fingerprints everywhere. There's an odd tenderness in that. Their names might blur, but their images linger. In gilt frames, marble busts, oil portraits fading around the edges, faces frozen halfway between triumph and farewell. You can almost hear the echo of laughter from long-vanished drawing rooms. Smell the gardens they once ruled like secret kingdoms. We keep them alive, not because they were perfect, but because they were complicated. They remind us that power and affection rarely fit neatly inside crowns. They remind us that being adored isn't the same as being secure. And perhaps most of all, that silence can be the most eloquent kind of survival. So now, as we drift toward the end of our long, drowsy tale, let's dim the lights just a little more and imagine the palace finally empty. No drums of ceremony, no murmured gossip, only echoing corridors and the faint scent of forgotten perfume. Somewhere, in a far wing, a door closes softly. A woman's footsteps fade down a marble stair. She isn't weeping, she's just tired. The king is gone. The courtiers have already chosen new loyalties, and she knows better than anyone how quickly history moves on. Maybe she takes one last look at her reflection in a dark window, the ghost of herself still shimmering faintly, then turns away before it fades completely. And just like that, she joins the quiet company of those who came before her. Jeanne, Barbara, Wilhelmine, Alice, Wallace, all the ghosts who learned the same lesson the hard way. That power dies noisily, but affection dies in whispers. And those whispers, they're still drifting somewhere between cradle and coffin, candlelight and sleep, history and imagination. That's where we find them, where they never quite disappear. So, dim the screen now, traveler of time. Let the past close its velvet curtains for the night. You've seen what happens after the king dies, and what remains after silence. Good night. Picture the town square, not the pleasant fairy tale version. More mud, less singing. There's always a church, always a bakery, never enough soap, and just off to one side, standing in a patch of worn-down earth that everyone pretends not to look at, is the executioner, the only man with a job literally no one else wants. He's not a monster. He's not the villain in a felt hat twirling a mustache and cackling. He's just a guy with a title, a carefully sharpened sword, and the distinct sense that after work, he's not exactly welcome at the tavern. In medieval Europe, executioners didn't just appear at the moment of drama, do their efficient bit, and vanish into the crowd. They lived in your town, shopped at the market, paid taxes, and were forced, by birth or profession, to live under the unblinking stare of collective dread. Being necessary is not the same as being popular. The double standard begins right here. The king's justice meant someone had to swing the sword, tie the noose, or build the pyre. But that same someone was never allowed to pretend his own hands were clean. Nobody wanted to shake them either. Executioners got their own tableware, sometimes a special cup and plate in public places, clearly labeled, like medieval do not touch signs. And yet, without them, the system fell apart. Kings needed order. Townsfolk wanted security. Cows may have wandered into the street. Diseases may have run wild. But one thing had to stay absolutely, terrifyingly reliable: punishment. So let's step quietly across the threshold of the executioner's house. Yes, on the edge of town. Yes, smaller than most. Yes, probably built with a discount. He didn't choose a life of outcast celebrity. Most likely, it was inherited. The job ran in families, passed along like a curse disguised as a tradition, because few outsiders were interested in learning how to wield an axe and alienate entire neighborhoods at the same time. Did you know some towns actually sweetened the deal for executioners with tax breaks? Yes, the original incentive package designed to keep anyone from fleeing in the night. In many German cities, executioners were invited from far away and given a house, land, maybe even a stipend, as long as they did the work nobody else was willing to put their name to. If they produced heirs willing to keep the business going, so much the better, though heaven helped their kids' social lives. Then there was the social status. Officially, the executioner was a servant of the state. A functionary as legally protected as he was despised on every other day but market day. He might get a handshake from the mayor, then another round of sideways glances from the crowd. On the religious holidays, when the whole town filed into church, he had his own seat, often at the very back, an invisible yet always present reminder that forgiveness wasn't for everyone. Spouses, children, sure, but the marriage prospects, shall we say, had rather limited horizons. Executioners tended to marry among themselves, or into equally tainted families, like knackers people who disposed of dead animals, gravediggers, and tanners. Their addresses were handed around town with a little side-eye, and the precedent for polite company might as well have been stitched above their front door. But why such disgust? Wasn't this a useful job? Of course. But in a world ruled by symbol and superstition, touching death, even justice-branded death, made you permanently unclean. No amount of public service could scrub away that stain. It gets better. Some towns passed laws banning executioners from living within the central walls, forcing them to settle literally on the periphery. Among the other professionals, nobody sent Christmas cards too. Vienna, Basel, Nuremberg, you name it. Their essay record somewhere of a city council taking a deep breath and explaining why the most valuable public servant had to be kept as far from the bakery as possible. Even the children weren't immune. Born an executioner's son or daughter. Good luck at school. Other kids, even teachers, often refused contact, fearing they'd catch bad luck, or worse, sin. Still, the job had its perks. If you were into weird fringe benefits, executioners could claim cast-off clothing and belongings of the condemned, the medieval equivalent of a company bonus. Sometimes, if particularly well-connected, they doubled as torturers, healers, or surgeons. Yes, in a twist of medieval logic, the man skilled with knives was just as likely to be called on for bloodletting or minor surgery. You use the tools you have. Desperate times made for even more desperate medical licensing. There are records, loads of Tim, hiding in slow-moving city ledgers, and forgotten chronicles of executioners running side businesses. Need a pig slaughtered? a dog put down, or assist lent. The executioner, blackballed at every party, was suddenly the most useful man in town. It didn't guarantee respect, of course. More likely, the same people who whispered for his help by night would make the sign of the cross as he passed in daylight. And the training, how did you become the next in line? There weren't exactly medieval boot camps, just a slow apprenticeship under a grim tutor who, more often than not, was your own father. You'd start with animals, build up to the worst kinds of lawbreakers, and only after years of shadowing did you graduate to full-time axeman or rope slinger. Famous names, oh, they existed. Meister Francis Schmidt Nuremberg's 16th century executioner kept a diary of his work. Nearly 400 executions, plus thousands of floggings and brandings, all carefully logged, day by day, in neat penmanship. Contrary to stereotype, he was a family man, well-educated, and eventually retired as a respected citizen. No mean feat for someone whose every job involved spilling blood. Yet even he complained about the isolation, the constant feeling of being watched and never quite belonging, and the actual work. Routine. Almost boring. Except for the very public bits. Executions were scheduled, announced, performed at noon so the crowds could gather. It was both entertainment and warning. And if you thought the executioner enjoyed center stage, think again. Often, he moved through the motions like a machine, as quickly and cleanly as possible, because botching it led to more than just embarrassment. Botched executions meant angry mobs, blame from the authorities, and sometimes, in a twisted turn, his own trial. Most went home exhausted, praying for a quiet night and no new names on the list come morning. Alcohol was a common crutch, numbing both the nerves and the guilt. Song lyrics subtly mocked. Executioners, always from a distance, and every festival, they remained just outside the circle. Invited, but not welcome. Welcomed, but not wanted. A walking paradox. When disaster hit the town, a plague, a fire, a string of murders, suspicion often landed first on the executioner's doorstep. Who else, after all, was so comfortable with death? Someone had to be blamed, and better him than the butcher or the priest. Over time, some executioners managed to buy their way into polite company, especially if a city wanted to clean up its image. Others faded quietly, their names surviving only in dusty court records and church registers. And through it all, they just kept working, year after grinding year. Necessary, invisible, never allowed to be fully human. That's medieval justice for you. Balance maintained, at terrible personal cost, by the man holding the sword no one else wanted to touch. Mourning for the medieval executioner didn't start with sunrise and birdsong, but with the particular silence that comes from knowing the whole town is awake before you and pretending not to be. The birds actually kept their distance. Maybe they'd seen enough not to want breakfast near that house. His home was always on the edge of things, as prescribed by law and custom. Early risers hustled by quickly, eyes averted, just in case casual small talk summoned bad luck. If the executioner's family grew vegetables or raised animals, neighbors bought them only when desperate. Never by choice, because rumor swore tainted hands made tainted food. Naturally, he'd check the tools first. Swords, axes, ropes, branding, irons. There was an inventory, and a professional had standards. A blunt axe ruined the show. A frayed rope caused gossip. Sharpening, oiling, cleaning became acts of self-preservation, and bad weather was no excuse for shoddy work. Some towns even fined executioners for using equipment deemed unclean. Imagine losing money for being insufficiently grim at your job. Breakfast, simple, plain, solitary. At most, bread, a little cheese, maybe some watered ale, if the night had not been kind. The executioner's wife, yes, he had won, usually equally shunned, kept family conversations soft and practical. What markets to visit, what supplies to avoid, which villagers glared a little less than usual. Children, if present, learned quickly how to disappear into chores. Nobody wanted the attention that came from being noticed. Then came official duties. The town council might send a runner breathless with a list of tasks, not just executions, but floggings, brandings, public humiliations, animal slaughters, and the most medieval of jobs, cleaning up after sudden deaths no one else could stomach. The executioner was a jack of all, toggling between government agent and unwanted neighbor with depressing efficiency. On market days, his presence became a performance. Every town had its own rules. Some let him shop during designated hours. Others forced him to identify himself on site, a colored badge, an unusual hat, a simple bell tied around the wrist. He'd stand in line, watch stallholders flinch, and pay with coin others handled like miniature curses. If he found brief solidarity anywhere, it was with other social outcasts, knackers, lepers, sometimes even jailers. These were the only people guaranteed not to judge, if only because their own lives were pinched just as tightly. Sometimes families banded together, sharing meals, negotiating marriages, quietly building networks beneath society's polished veneer. The work itself was never glamorous. Executions, of course, held the spotlight. But most days didn't end with an axe and a crowd. Instead, the executioner made rounds at prisons, logged punishments for disorderly conduct, oversaw the disposal of criminal bodies, and managed for extra coin the less gory tasks nobody else accepted. And yes, sometimes he moonlighted as a healer. Strange, but true. In a world where medicine was mostly folk wisdom and wishful thinking, the man most skilled in anatomy was called for surgeries, setting bones, even childbirths. He was technically forbidden most professions, but poverty overruled etiquette. If a surgeon cost too much, villagers visited the executioner after dark, and paid what they could, grateful, but never visibly so. Children picked up the knowledge faster than anyone wanted. Knife skills, anatomy, basic herbal medicine, all practical, if rather bleak. Schools rarely admitted them. Religious instruction was usually done at home. Community events only when forced, and always at a remove. The family learned early to keep friendships few and secrets many. Social life, best described as stunted. Invitations to weddings, festivals, or public feasts were rare, and attendance kept to minimum courtesy. If he danced, his partners stared at their own shoes, laughed too loudly, and he'd be accused of arrogance, speak too softly, and suspicion grew. But there were moments he could savor. On official business, like executions, he became briefly, unhappily, the center of everything. Crowds pressed in, rumors swirled, and everyone craned to see how skillfully he dispatched justice. A clean job bought grudging praise. A messy one brought complaints to the council. Sometimes, after a particularly dramatic sentence, gifts would appear. Food, coins, even fine cloth, presented anonymously. No one wanted a public association, but plenty wanted the executioner's personal gratitude. Ibn Tekin, from his distant throne, occasionally sent thanks. One more reminder that power always cozied up to necessity. Privacy, of course, was precious and rare. Neighbors speculated endlessly. Did the executioner pray? And to which saints, if any? Did he feel guilt? Did he have a dream of escape? Occasionae anxiety or shame drove them to drink. Some became notorious for public drunkenness, a sort of involuntary rebellion against constant social frost. If he traveled for work, a plague in one town, a crime spree in another, the reception was awkwardly predictable. New arrivals, especially, forced him to sleep outside city gates until his credentials were confirmed. On se settlet, he'd do his best to blend into the margins. Quick errands, faster departures, and no lingering near the well. Did the executioner ever have friends? Technically, yes, but the term was relative. Some priests felt compassion and offered secret visits. Now and then, a merchant quietly bartered goods for professional courtesy. But mostly, he lived parallel to the lives of others, belonging everywhere and nowhere. And not all was lost. Some towns valued their executioners enough to grant them permanent family housing, limited legal immunity, and even burial rights inside the city cemetery. a rare privilege. Others shoved them out, both metaphorically and literally, ensuring they left only footprints after their final day. Retirement, for those who got there, meant fading into near invisibility. Sons inherited the role. Daughters sometimes married into it. Some men documented their work, like Schmidt, leaving behind careful, cold records for future generations of historians but most simply disappeared, remembered only in stories, whispered to scared children on stormy nights. And society carried on, pretending each new executioner was just another necessary evil, tolerating his presence with all the grace of a meal that has gone cold and can tea be sent back. Justice needed a human hand, but never a familiar face. That was the medieval paradox. So, picture the executioner again. Town square, in full view. But now let's step outside the daily grind and into the tangle of shame, fear, and very peculiar neighborhood politics that defined his social world. If medieval society was a play, the executioner was permanently cast as both stage crew and villain, there for every climax, banished after every curtain call. Let's start with the worst of it. The stigma. It's not just that people avoided him, it's that they built entire superstitions around his existence. Touching his shadow could bring a family bad luck. Drinking from his mug might curse your next child. There are records of townsfolk crossing the street, or even spitting when he passed, just to ward off the whiff of unclean death. Grandmothers warned children not to answer his greetings. Even dogs shied away, as if by instinct. Officially, he was the arm of justice. Unofficially, he was treated as though a single handshake could curse your entire bloodline. Imagine being the only person in town who could get both a government-issued salary and a midnight vandal writing "go away" on your door. Some records show that if the executioner even entered someone's house, it needed to be ritually cleansed. Marriage proposals were politely declined with a shout. Town festivals made special rules just for him. Stand over there, eat only from your own dish. Leave first. Thank you very much. A few towns went so far as to pass laws requiring executioners to ring a bell when approaching key public places, like a medieval Amazon, out for delivery notification, but for social dread. But let's also look for the light in all this gloom. Executioners, some of them, refused to be defined only by the blade. There are stories always passed along as half-jokes, but probably true of executioners who became anonymous benefactors to orphans, or quietly paid poor families taxes from their tip money after executions. Some secretly protected, condemned criminals who'd been wrongly accused, inventing botched executions so the crowd could collectively agree to a miraculous survival and let the case drop. They were often closer to the suffering of criminals than anyone else. It was the rare executioner who had at least once whispered a prayer for the souls he dispatched, or offered a kind if brief final word to the condemned. After all, for them, the boundary between guilt and fate was always thin. Many executioners lived in quiet terror that one day the town would turn on them a failed crop, a sudden fever, a new mayor, and suddenly the man wielding justice becomes its next victim. History is, as always, full of odd little wrinkles. In some places, if a person was executed unjustly, the crowd might blame the executioner's evil and pelt him with stones. In others, a cleanly done job was rewarded with flowers, food, even the occasional awkward public handshake. No one liked it, but everyone wanted it to go smoothly. There's a human honesty in that contradiction. Now and then, rebels and outlaws became folk heroes. And yes, sometimes executioners quietly sympathized with the accused, especially if the condemned was a friend or relative. Rarely, but not never, secrets were shared before the blade fell. Old accounts from France and Germany mention executioners sneaking last sips of water or quietly passing a note to grieving family. Small gestures, huge risks. Some towns, realizing their own hypocrisy, gave up on ostracizing their executioners. Instead, they let the family become pillars of a strange little sub-community, a town within a town. Kids learned the trade, then hired themselves out elsewhere to avoid local resentments. Sometimes, after years on the job and careful political maneuvering, the family could successfully rebrand themselves, start businesses, gain friends, even join guilds, if reluctantly admitted. Even the church struggled with their role. Most executioners weren't technically excommunicated. Someone had to keep them in line, but neither were they welcomed freely into the flock. Confession and communion were sometimes reserved for after hours, or in private, with a priest whose smile was sympathetic but wary. More than a few priests suffered guilt for giving compassion to the one man nobody else could stand. On rare occasions, a town became genuinely proud of a merciful executioner, one who developed a reputation for swift, almost gentle deaths, for finding ways to reduce pain and humiliation. The line between justice and cruelty was blurry at best, so efficiency became its own kind of virtue. Chronicles mention certain executioners who became local legends, their names passed along with a sentimental sigh as the best anyone could hope for, given the circumstances. Those circumstances sometimes required surprising forms of negotiation. Executioners sold executioner-themed souvenirs, knives, ropes, charms, said to offer protection from death if bought and kept at home. This is either self-sabotage or marketing genius, depending on your perspective. A few ventured into medicine, especially when plague made every healer precious. Their anatomical skills were suddenly worth gold, and prejudice faded a little, until the next festival, when nobody invited them. Again, in the darkest moments, some executioners rebelled. There are stories of men who left their posts without warning, hoping to start over in another town where their names weren't nailed to every door. Autres staged drinking themselves into numbness, or turning their bitterness outward in cruelty during executions, a feedback loop of pain and resentment that history remembers with extra scorn. But the quieter ones left traces too. Ledgers full of careful handwriting stories told in the smallest possible voice. Accounts of fathers teaching sons to watch the blade's edge for signs of dullness, and above all the strange sense of pride that comes from surviving a life designed for exclusion. To the people of their time, they were walking paradoxes, reminders that for all society's piety and justice, someone always had to suffer so the rest could feel safe, a symbolic sacrifice renewed with every public sentence. There are towns in Germany and Austria that still remember their old executioners with a kind of melancholic pride. Their houses marked and sometimes visited as curiosities. Some descendants keep the family name alive, even as modern profession as surgeons, police officers, public officials offer a cleaner path with a shadowy echo of that same old responsibility. And so the double life continued, century after century, needed but not wanted, called upon but not invited. Even as laws changed and public executions became rare, the memory lingered, a stubborn footnote in the collective memory. The role only ended when society finally, or maybe just impatient, it could no longer stomach its own need for scapegoat, and the stories, awkward and overlooked, remained, waiting in the margins, unsettling, necessary, a gentle reminder that even justice, in its cleanest form, leaves someone standing alone at the edge of the crowd. Centuries passed, and the world changed. Swords became muskets, kings became parliaments, and even justice got a fresh coat of paint. But executioners, they changed in fits and starts, like a house no one bothers to renovate until the roof actually caves in. By the 17th century, public executions had become a sort of national theater. The crowds grew, the moralizing sermons got louder. Some towns hired special showmen to narrate the deaths, turning punishment into a ghastly mix of warning and entertainment, and through it all, the executioner tried to do his strange, lonely work with as much dignity as a man could manage, while the whole city watched him check the blade one last time. But cracks were forming beneath the spectacle. The Enlightenment arrived, carrying new ideas about justice, mercy, and community. Suddenly there were people, sometimes even wealthy ones, who argued that public death might be just a touch barbaric. Books appeared critiquing the bloody rites. Philosophers wrote essays, questioning the moral stain placed on one single human, as if the swing of the axe was dirtier than the crime being punished. Governments listened, though reluctantly. Executions were moved out of town, performed at dawn, restricted to smaller audiences. In some places, executioners became even more invisible, their names omitted from records. Their families offered bribes to leave quietly, The community eager to forget the years when righteousness and violence had to share a mailing address. It helped when machines took over. The guillotine, efficient, impersonal, offered at least the illusion that justice was no longer a matter of skill, that justice was a collective act, not one man's dirty work. The last executioners in France became mere operators, required to show little flair for the dramatics, rewarded mostly by being left in peace afterward. By the 19th century, the music had nearly stopped. Some countries abolished public executions entirely. Others turned them into cold, bureaucratic rituals. Executioners, having lost their dubious celebrity, found odd new forms of relevance. Some taught anatomy at local universities. Others faded into government pensions, living out their years as curiosities, sometimes as objects of pity. But even as the job faded, the stigma clung on. There are stories from 19th century England and Germany, rural towns where people still crossed themselves if they saw the former executioner out for a morning walk. Grandchildren sometimes found themselves moving to cities just to escape a legacy no one would actually talk about. Yet the row refused to vanish without some final tricks. In legend and popular culture, the executioner became a kind of haunted archetype. Grim, hooded, anonymous, more symbol than person. The real men, with their aches and contradictions and clumsy attempts at respectability, disappeared into dusty town ledgers and family stories nobody ever told in full daylight. Occasionally their names returned to the news when an old sword was found buried in a field, or a long-lost diary surfaced in a crumbling archive. Some executioners, like the infamous Charles Henry Sanson of French Revolution, fame became reluctant folk heroes. Their skills reimagined as acts of reluctant mercy, their personal struggles, a stand-in for everyone who ever felt, used by systems too big to change. And then, at last, the world moved on. The 20th century brought new systems of justice, new horrors, new debates over punishment. The need for a resident executioner became not just obsolete, but faintly horrifying to anyone who'd grown up with stories about human rights and due process. The children and grandchildren of executioners scattered. Family names changed. Houses were sold. Some towns tried to scrub the memory completely. The old executioner's house torn down for a new school. The family tomb left unmarked and weed-choked. Others, more sentimental or just more stubborn, kept the legend alive for tourists half proud and half ashamed of the blood that had once bought peace of mind. If you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of their lives in awkward places. The word hangman used as a playground taunt executioner's lane. On an old street sign souvenir, nooses sold in markets that now prefer chocolate to ghosts. And for historians, amateur or sleepless or both, the executioners will always be the best sort of mystery. They stood at the heart of power but belonged nowhere. They were necessary and despised, visible and erased, human and unhuman, often in the same conversation. Their gift and their curse was to become living metaphors, reminders that every society has someone it needs, but refuses to accept. Sometimes it's the people who remove society's garbage. Sometimes it's those who heal its sickness. And once, for a very long time, it was the people who administered its justice one careful swing at a time. So if you ever walked by the edge of an old European town and see a crumbling, isolated cottage with walls just slightly thicker than the rest, you'll know what it is, and you'll know, too, why nobody ever planted roses there, or why neighbors pretend not to remember the stories. Forgotten, but never quite invisible. The last executioners died out quietly, almost always poor, sometimes at peace, more often not. Their children blended in where they could, became farmers, merchants, teachers, anything but what their fathers had done. And nobody ever picked up the blade voluntarily again, not unless society forced their hand. Now, centuries later, the lines between justice and cruelty, between social order and social exile, blur in new forms. The executioner is gone. But the questions remain. Who gets blamed for doing what everyone else wants done? Who carries the stains so everyone else feels clean? Who stands at the edge, necessary one moment, shunned the next? That's where the real story of executioners lives now. Not in blood or legend, but in the uncomfortable silences all societies keep for their necessary evils. So, as we ease out of our long, unglamorous, sleep-inducing wander through the lives of those men on the edge. Remember, justice survives because someone pays the price nobody else wants to pay. And when you encounter a story about an outsider, an undesirable, or a shadowy figure needed and overlooked, think for a moment of the medieval executioners. They didn't choose their double life. Society did, and then politely looked away. Good night. Somewhere behind every castle's gleaming facade is a hallway no tourist ever tours. A door that doesn't open for ambassadors or musicians or even most servants. The hall rarely gets sunlight. The door stays bolted from the outside. And beneath, you usually find one of those forgotten royal children, someone born with a pedigree, but no invitation to the throne or society's memory. It's a bit of a running joke in history. For every king who managed to keep his dynasty intact, there were usually a few siblings or stepchildren, quietly erased, gently nudged toward early retirement, in a monastery or packed off to a countryside estate where visitors were discouraged and correspondence monitored. The real-life version of being sent away to a farm, only with more prayers and less fresh air. Take medieval England. Henry VIII may have turned divorce into high art, but his ancestors were just as creative when it came to thinning out family trees. Spare sons could end up as bishops. Ecclesiastical careers were a handy way to keep excess testosterone in check and minimize the odds of teenage rebellion. Royal daughters could be encouraged into lifelong nunhood. Often, as soon as they hit adolescence, some siblings got thrown straight into house arrest. For every Edward IV or Richard III, there was an unlucky child or cousin sent to gardens that seemed oddly heavy on stone walls, with not nearly enough sunlight. You had to wonder if their lives ever felt like stories, or just a very slow evening with suspiciously early curfews. France wasn't much kinder. In the Valois and Bourbon dynasties, spare children were liabilities. Too many princes meant too many potential civil wars, so the best way to ensure peace was to disappear them into abbeys and It was sold to the public as piety. How virtuous, how noble, to give your son to God. But behind the scenes, there was usually some awkward conversation involving a signature, a scowl, and a lifelong staff of caretakers. Some got better deals. At least in theory. Gifted daughters sent to convents occasionally became powerful Abbé antiques, roadshow version of royalty with more Latin and less jewelry. These women wielded real authority, but all at a discreet distance from crown politics. Meanwhile, their brothers got to meditate on loyalty and obedience with the daily discipline of rising at sunrise and helping with questionable medieval medical experiments. But the best stories are always the darkest. Case in point, Ivan the Terrible of Russia, not a man known for subtlety. Ivan had approximately zero patience for siblings threatening his rule. Rival princes and brothers were offered the peaceful life of a monastery, which more often meant a life of constant surveillance and warnings against excessive enthusiasm. In a pinch, he'd send them to distant provinces where winter expected you to apologize for surviving. Then there was the Ottoman tradition. Solutions ranged from polite exile, if you were lucky, to more permanent arrangements. Ottoman princes were famously locked away in the caves, a pleasant-sounding word meaning cage. Luxurious but inescapable apartments designed to keep would-be sultans from ever becoming actual sultans. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the isolation drove them mad. And sometimes one clever prince would escape, launch a coup, and create a new round of forgotten children for the next generation. India had its own spin. Mughal emperors collected heirs, and rivals like chess pieces. Too many sons meant constant intrigue. So Ottophiva princes were politely invited to retire in distant fortresses, watched by guards who were paid not just to keep them in, but make sure letters home included only the most boring updates possible. A little poetry, a lot of nostalgia. Never any requests for passports. But even outside the big empires, royal families had their secrets. Portugal, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, everywhere, extra siblings or half-siblings were shuffled off the board. Some got titles. Others got barely readable mentions in land records. Their names abbreviated like afterthoughts. And then there were the stepchildren, illegitimate offspring, and political hostages. These kids were rarely given much chance for a normal childhood. Sometimes they were exchanged as bargaining chips, sent to foreign courts as unofficial insurance against betrayal. The joke among diplomats was that royal children had more frequent flyer miles than actual monarchs, always traveling, never arriving where they wanted. Royal kids erased from the official histories. Of course, chroniclers learned fast. Only mention those who matter. Politely forget the rest. It's amazing how many brothers of kings died young, daughters preferred God's service, and nephews moved to the countryside with poor health, only for those same people to live quietly into old age, surrounded by books and cats, but never once receiving an official birthday greeting from the palace. The psychological toll. Historians can only guess. To be born into promise, educated in courtly manners or scripture, and then shuffled offstage sometimes as punishment for the crime of being born between inconvenient dates. The greatest danger for a royal child wasn't rebellion or bad luck. It was simply existing in the wrong political moment. Palaces, it turns out, were good at locking doors and losing keys. Some children became urban myths. The other daughter, the sad prince of the West Wing, the singing nun who never saw her family again. Once in a while, someone escaped, sending scandalous letters home, and the royal public relations machine would hum into overdrive, pages erased, stories changed, memories rewritten for the next coronation. A few became legends. Look at the princes in the Tower, Edward V and his brother Richard, locked away by their uncle Richard III. They vanished from the historical record so efficiently that, centuries later, mystery still hangs over their fate. Every time their bones are dug up anew, someone writes a paper, another documentary is made, and yet the answer remains lost in the castle's shadow. In some cases, these lost children were mourned quietly by their families, especially mothers or siblings who lacked political power but cherished private memories. Secret visits, hidden gifts, letters passed under doors. It is no coincidence that some royal memoirs, those rare few that survived, are filled with guilty asides and wistful references to my brother, whom I loved but saw only twice after childhood. On the rarest occasions, a forgotten child made it back. A regime change. A soft heart. A new ruler decided to invite the cousin from the monastery back to court. Sometimes they flourished, becoming trusted advisors, scholars, or just quiet reminders of the dangers of political chess. But more often, they were tolerated, never truly trusted, never truly loved. Meanwhile, official painters skillfully avoided portraits of the sidelined children. No need to confuse posterity or create new lines of claimants. Portraits, like stories, focused on the favored few, the ones the king needed most, not the ones he feared might be popular alternatives. And let's not forget the religious solution. For many dynasties, shuffling a child into the priesthood guaranteed harmless obscurity. The Vatican itself sometimes became a home for royal sons who were just a little too ambitious, or royal daughters whose marriage prospects were politically complicated. The result? A landscape of abbeys, priories, and remote estates filled with exiles, living polite, quiet lives, watched over by the gentle terror of royal courtesy. Some grew too, like their enforced peace. Others dreamed of the palace they barely remembered. Behind the grand tapestries and golden gates was a parallel history, one written in lost letters and half-whispered prayers for siblings the world agreed not to know. The silent corridors, the locked rooms, the names crossed out in ledgers, and the quiet hope that someday someone would remember not just the throne, but the children who almost reached it. Let's settle further into the velvet gloom, past the faintly lit portraits of monarchs who never aged and siblings who never got proper portraits, because the best study of forgotten royal children, ISNT, the ones scribbled over in history books, it's the ones who nearly changed everything, only to disappear because they existed at the wrong moment. Start with the European classics. The Capetian, Plantagenet, Tudor, and Habsburg dynasties' masters at creative sidelining. Take the fate of Charles, Duke of Orleans, France. 15th century, he spent 25 years as a hostage in England, after technically honored, but in reality, a political bargaining chip, less family, more diplomatic currency. By the time he returned home, Everything had changed. He was received politely, written into poems, but always kept at arm's length from royal power. His time away made him irrelevant, beloved by poets, but feared by politicians. Then there's poor Margaret of Austria, Belgium, Austria, 16th century. She was betrothed as a child for political alliances, widowed, then packed off to oversee a region as its regent. She never ruled in her own right, but her letters hinted a permanently melancholy child, forced to flatter relatives and steer clear of any real authority. Her education was impeccable, her influence behind the scenes impressive, but she was always just the daughter or sister advising, never deciding. England can't be ignored. Edmund Tudor, half-brother to Henry VI, was sent away as a child, ultimately executed in Wales. Little Margaret Pole, cousin to the Tudor line and Plantagenet princess, survived serial dynastic disasters, imprisoned, released, imprisoned again, finally executed at age 67, long after her claim to anything was erased by sheer exhaustion. Her children met similar fates, dropped into monasteries or distant estates whenever paranoid kings felt the need for security. And then the saga of Joanna la Beltranea of Castile, caught between warring parentage and questionable legitimacy, used as a pawn during endless Spanish succession struggles. She wound up in a Portuguese convent, officially choosing religious life, but in practice living out the remainder of her years, politely ignored by everyone who once called her a princess. Ottoman palaces took disappearing siblings to an art form. The infamous Kaif's cage system held royal brothers under virtual house arrest. Gilded apartments with gardens and fountains. The logic: if you're not allowed to rule, at least you should be comfortable. For centuries, dozens of would-be sultans lived out their entire lives inside palace walls, growing old in isolation, so the reigning monarch could sleep soundly. Some tried to escape. One, Ahmed II, spent 34 years in the cage before finally ascending the throne at age 51. Too old, too sick, too paranoid to lead with any freedom. Most stayed silent, their names appearing only in boring records about food deliveries or changes in staff. Asia offers equally haunting stories. In Korea, the Joseon dynasty's spare princes were quietly sent to Buddhist monasteries or remote provincial posts. If a particular sibling grew popular or clever, it wasn't long before accusations of plotting popped up. One quiet arrest, one quick relocation, an awkward family dinner, everyone pretended hadn't happened. Mughal India was notorious for its retirement policies. Shah Jahan's younger children were shuffled to far-off forts, their attendants reporting every word. Some became artists, writers, or even half-mad mystics. Dara Shikoh, philosopher prince, was imprisoned and killed after his brother Aurangzeb took the throne. The lucky survivors became palace ghosts, their names surviving mostly because their poetry or painting was too beautiful to shred. Now and then the process worked in reverse. Sweden's Prince Gustav was sent abroad for safety, seen again only when someone bothered to stir up old succession rumors. Russia's Ivan VI was declared Tsar as a baby, locked in fortress prisons for life after Elizabeth seized power, finally dying in solitary confinement after an accidental prison rescue. His reign was summarized in history as forgotten, regretted, erased. Not all forgotten children were royal stars. Many were simply unlucky, caught between politics one day, gone from memory the next. Sometimes dynastic disasters produced large numbers of extra siblings, shuffled quietly into smaller houses, with the vague promise that they'd never make trouble. One example, the children of Louis XV France, who lost beloved siblings to smallpox at court, and learned early that even titled children were replaceable. Surviving kids watched their brothers and sisters die, then felt themselves gently pushed aside if they seemed unsuitable for politics. Royal exiles sometimes tried to make life bearable. Many became patrons of the arts, sustaining artists, writers, and philosophers who needed protection from official censors. They built salons, taught music, hosted secret gatherings, alive in spirit, absent in government. Their rooms were thick with candlelight and the low hum of private rebellion. Monasteries filled with royal faces, some adopting religious robes with resignation, others fueling small political intrigues. Abbeys kept luxury goods hidden. Nuns and monks exchanged whispers about birthrights and lost fortunes. Their prayers, written in careful Latin, often contained hidden barbs about worldly injustice. A few abbesses wielded more money than local nobles, but always understood that their power was conditional. One cross letter from the palace and their career, like their siblings, evaporated. In rare moments, forgotten children re-entered public life. Polish Prince Mieczysław spent years in exile, returned, and became king briefly, and mostly due to public desperation rather than royal favor. His reign was a study in how little anyone trusted a comeback. Sometimes a child became more dangerous in exile than at court. European diplomatic historians still debate how many wars began because off-the-board princes convinced foreign armies to intervene, or offended someone important with too much poetry, charm, or ambition. Not every story ends in tragedy. A handful of lucky or determined royal exiles found happiness in small places. Patronage, family, personal faith. They married outsiders, raised children with no pretense of grandeur, lived quietly under their last names rather than titles. They were the background music to history's big, loud dramas. There's also the version where forgotten children weren't even supposed to exist. Illegitimate sons and daughters faced a lifetime of erasure, not in monasteries or fortresses, but in bureaucratic silence. They had to build identities from scratch, often latching onto the arts, sciences, or in rare cases stunning adventures abroad. Some became explorers, ship captains, even pirates, their royal blood diluted into myth but never entirely forgotten. If you combine it all, palaces across the world became haunted by their own history, full of hidden rooms, unsent letters, and melancholic portraits fading in musty air. Every generation had a dozen new stories. Cats disappearing into corridors, echoing footsteps, laughter stopped short at the sight of a closed door. Letters from exiles to their families are full of polite longing, repartee, the kind of philosophical resignation that only comes from knowing ULL. Never attend the coronation or dedicate a book with your real name. Archives across Europe and Asia hold entire collections of letters from forgotten princes and princesses, some bitter, some nostalgic, some resigné. A few became cautionary tales. French legend speaks of Charles de Bourbon, forced into clerical life after his elder brother became king, famous for his wit and absolute lack of diplomacy. His letters survive, brimming with elegant complaints and the quiet threat that he could, if pressed, make things very awkward for the palace. And, of course, there's the occasional miracle. Nobles sent into obscurity, who decades later became public favorites, hosting salons, writing best-selling memoirs, or reappearing in dramatic family emergencies. Their comebacks were rare, unpredictable, and almost always dependent on palace intrigue or popular unrest. History did its best to ignore or simplify the stories. Genealogies left out siblings who vanished. Governments erased records, and chroniclers made special efforts to focus on heirs, not extras. Still, if you look closely at nearly every kingdom's family tree, you'll spot the abrupt branchings, the names that lead nowhere, the footnotes hinting at entire lives spent in the twilight. These children remind us that palace life, no matter how dazzling, chose its favorites with cold precision. One day you're playing with cousins in the sun. Next, you're reciting prayers in a distant abbey or making polite conversation over cold dinners, surrounded by people more interested in your silks than your story. Forgotten children filled the margins. Their faces linger in lost sketches, archives, and legends. Their names quietly echo every time a new heir is born, and someone quietly asks, "And what about the rest?" For all the locked doors and vanished titles, royal children didn't always fade out quietly. Sometimes, the exile invented an inner world, stronger than any dynasty, a resilience that filled the silence with almost heroic stubbornness. The heart might break, but the voice will, that found clever ways to echo through generations. It's tempting to picture forgotten royal children as gentle ghosts, just harmless souls gliding through palaces with a sigh. But denial creates its own intelligence. Watch their stories closely, and you'll spot patterns of defiance. The cryptic poem, the clever letter, the carefully timed bit of gossip, each floating just outside the reach of official histories. Take the famously lost children of the Medici. For every Lorenzo the Magnificent, There were siblings posted to remote monasteries, their calls for leniency wrapped in witty Latin and subtly barbed prayers. Some nursed grudges that eventually boomeranged into scandals. One accidentally inspired revolt here, a well-placed rumor there. Centuries later, Florence still whispers about pious abbots and wise nuns who, in younger years, nearly set states on fire with a suggestive note. A subtle art formed in exile how to shape the world without signing your name. Some wrote plays, anonymously critiquing the family tree. Others patronized struggling thinkers, creating literary salons, funding philosophers who later appended palace doctrine. Out of forced invisibility, they learned to cherish the power of invisibility. Sometimes that meant helping a doubly harassed cousin escape, or quietly sheltering rebels under abbey roofs. Resigned siblings grew sly. Many, living in daily suspicion, created unexpected alliances with disinherited cousins, trusted servants, the local clergy, or even rivals turned. Surrounded by people who expected safeness, the forgotten child learned to listen, influence, and weave connections that lasted longer than any sealed decree. If you think palace intrigue happened only at the center, you haven't read enough stories from the edge. Psychologically, exile worked a quiet transformation. A royal child, forced out young, might become melancholy or reclusive or, given enough time, a kind of wry philosopher. Diaries found centuries later are full of biting wit, elegant resignation, and a kind of sorrowful clarity nobody writing from the throne ever captured. "All the world loves the king," wrote one sidelined Bourbon. "But the world forgets the king's shadow rises only because someone else sits in darkness." Some rebelled outright, penning poems lampooning rulers or writing defensive histories that politely skewered the family image. Others turned internal, spiritual seekers, scholars, and mystics. Banished from court, a surprising number devoted their lives to learning, faith, or the arts, quietly accruing respect that lasted centuries longer than those who wore crowns. Not every rebellion worked, of course. A few raised armies, generally small, underfunded, remembered only in cautionary footnotes. The success rate was discouraging, but every failed uprising left behind one or two legends, tales that colored children's games and haunted the palace halls for decades afterwards. Sometimes, forgotten children even shaped succession itself. Fears of wayward siblings prompted kings to have more children, more marriages, and more paranoia. Over time, palaces became mazes of secret retirement wings, lonely towers, and cramped guests' mansions at the edge of the royal grounds, the gray zone of hereditary power, where everyone was always polite, but breakfast was taken firmly in silence. The quieter acts of revolution, though, are more interesting. When exiled brothers or sisters chose not to return hate with hate, or tried to bridge bitter family divides, their gentle interventions shaped generations. Letters written across enemy lines, secret meetings in convent kitchens, these collaborations rescued many families from full extinction, even as their writers vanished from formal memory. One unexpected upside. The arts flourished. Lonely sons and daughters became extraordinary musicians, translators, architects, and medical pioneers. Some of the greatest advances came from these unofficial scholars, freed from the demands of public image. They had time to pursue knowledge without courtly distractions. Irony loves forgotten children. While rulers battled over thrones, the sidelined siblings quietly preserved or extended the family's legacy, in fields ranging from theology to textiles. Sometimes, their obscurity proved a shield. During wars and palace coups, exiles were overlooked and thus survived to serve as advisors or regents when entire dynasties had demolished themselves. The spare sibling in the monastery found himself regent when the main branch faltered, and sometimes proved wiser precisely because of a life spent watching, not ruling. Of course, the personal toll was high. Memoirs tell of relentless loneliness, suspicion, or that chilling experience of seeing one's childhood erased from official record, having your birthday quietly deleted, or your face cut from family portraits, replaced by a more convenient heir. Many international treaties bartered away royal children, but few mention the personal loss, the lack of identity, the slow diminishment of belonging. You existed, but not as yourself. Some became obsessed with posterity, hiding secret diaries for future relatives. Many wrote spiritual treatises or practical handbooks for dealing with exile. How to Survive Exile with Dignity and Clean Linens is not a book you'll find on most palace shelves, but it's in every royal archive, if you read between the lines. Every now and then, the contemporary world discovers one of these Liza musty bundle of letters in a cathedral vault, a cell with names carved into the stone, a half-finished portrait hastily covered by a curtain. Then comes a flickering moment of public interest, a flurry of documentaries or opinion pieces. But the world soon forgets again, turning its fascination back to the noisy center. Yet, these stories matter. They reveal the truth behind the fairy tale. Monarchy depends on forgetting almost as much as remembering. Coronations are built on the graves and retirements of Nemesis. The shining procession down the main hall means there's always someone in the shadowy wing, listening as the music fades. The reason why so many ghost stories in ancient palaces revolve around children: lost prince, footsteps, the sigh of a nun in the old chapel, the faint sound of music from a room sealed by royal order. Memory, in old houses, has an uncanny way of clinging to the forgotten. If you trace the line from one vanished child to another, across centuries and capitals, you find a strange fraternity. An invisible family of those whose lives were determined by political anxieties and the fragile dreams of dynasties. You also discover an enormous archive of resilience. Every faded name, every lost painting, every locked diary is proof that survival does not require attention. In their failure to make history, these children often preserved it. In not being crowned, they gained the freedom to question the value of crowns. And so, as the centuries rolled on, every ruling family learned the same anxious lesson: managing the margin was as important as managing the throne. The art of forgetting was part of ruling. Palaces became as skilled at inventing saints as they were at inventing secret passageways. You could call it sad, and you'd be right. But it's also comforting. The forgotten children, in their small ways, made history honest, not just a pageant of winners, but a mosaic of endurance, longing, and gentle sabotage. By the time the 20th century dawned, palaces across the globe had quietly accumulated more hidden stories than official records. Forgotten royal children weren't just footnotes. They were symbols of ambition dared and denied, of love lost in politics, and of histories written in whispers. In recent decades, historians, novelists, and filmmakers have started to dust off the old ledgers and manuscripts, turning forgotten children from shadowy figures into the protagonists of new narratives. They don't just put faces to erased names, they humanize politics. Shows and movies now feature tragic princes locked away, secret princesses who defied convent life, siblings plotting quietly from exile. In a way taught as more empathetic than the old official histories ever dared to be, they remind audiences that monarchy was never just crowns and ceremonies. It was also heartbreak, exile, and quiet resistance. Even scholarship has evolved. New letters discovered in dusty archives reveal correspondence that shows these children were not always helpless. Some shaped alliances, brokered ceasefires, or built vast networks of influence from monasteries and border estates. Their power often lay in subtlety, a kind of soft revolution. Museums exhibit portraits once hidden, with stories that blend nobility with survival instincts. Genealogies now include branches once chopped away, acknowledging the full picture, not just kings and queens, but the many who nearly were. Public fascination with lost princes and forgotten princesses persists because their stories are unexpectedly modern, themes of isolation, identity, rejection, and resilience that resonate beyond history buffs to anyone who's ever felt sidelined or overshadowed. Their legacy is a complicated one, but also hopeful. For every locked room or locked fate, there's evidence that human spirit found cracks in the walls. They created art, built knowledge, showed courage in quiet corners of history. So when we speak of royal dynasties, we do well to remember the entire household, not only the reigning monarch, but also the hidden children. They remind us that history isn't just the story of winners, but of those who lived in waiting, hoping, and sometimes quietly changing the course of events in between. As you close your eyes tonight, consider their rooms in silence. The locked doors, the unopened letters, the fading echoes of footsteps, once destined for a throne. Their stories are among the softest echoes of the past, but no less real, no less alive. And perhaps, in their gentle absence, they teach us something timeless. That every shadow has a story, that forgetting is never final, and that power is as fragile as the human heart beneath the crown. Picture medieval Europe, not as the dusty, rang-smelling nightmare legend tells us, but as a world surprisingly concerned with personal cleanliness, smell management, and some rather elaborate bathing rituals. Forget the myth of 1,000 years without a bath people batted, and not just once in a blue moon. For the wealthy, bathing was a luxury and a social event. Kings like Charlemagne famously bathed with their nobles and even crowds of attendants, sometimes more than 100 people in one royal bath. Bathhouses thrived in cities like Paris and Prague, serving as places not just to get clean, but to gossip, eat, drink, and yes, occasionally indulge in less than innocent affairs. The bathhouse was basically the medieval version of the local pub, just wetter and with fewer chairs. For the average person, bathing daily might sound impossible or exaggerated, but washing the face and hands was a daily ritual everywhere, considered essential for health and good manners. Monks, despite their reputations, were actually expected to bathe several times a year, sometimes with paid bath attendants. Soap, made from tallow or olive oil, scented with herbs, was known and used, especially among the upper classes. Medieval dental hygiene wasn't neglected either. Twigs from hazel trees were chewed like primitive toothbrushes, while others wiped their teeth with cloth. Mouthwashes made from cloves and other herbs were common, partly medicinal, partly to freshen breath. Toothpicks, too, were in use. Hygiene was practical, if not glamorous. Perfumes played a significant role, with limited plumbing and unpaved streets, guaranteeing that odors wafted freely. Herbs like lavender, rosemary, sage, and rosewater were essential tools for masking unpleasant smells and providing medicinal protection. Roses and other floral scents were used in hand-washing after meals, while aromatic pomanders, little balls filled with herbs and spices, hung from belts or in rooms to fend off bad pestilent air. The church's attitude towards bathing was mixed. Official writings sometimes warned against immodesty or moral laxity at mixed bath, condemning public nudity and the risk of illicit behavior. Yet, enforcement was spotty, and locals clearly valued the bathhouse as much for socializing as sanitation. The arrival of syphilis and other diseases in later medieval centuries led to the decline of public baths, as fear of contagion and rising puritanical attitudes prompted bans and closures. But for much of the medieval period, being clean was both an act of health and an art of social grace. So, when imagining medieval people and their smells, think not of universal stench, but rather a complex olfactory world, one scented with oils, and the occasional waft of wood smoke or livestock. Nobles often bathed in scented oils and soaps, peasants washed with water and herbs. Townsfolk frequented lively baths, and even monks, despite austerity, kept a careful if limited hygiene schedule. Their smell? Probably a bit like a medieval garden, fresh herbs, rose water, wood smoke, and humans doing their best with resources available. Certainly not the unwashed images that popular culture has stubbornly clung to. That's the reality hidden beneath centuries of myth. Medieval people cared about cleanliness, hygiene, and scent in ways both surprising and sophisticated. Public bathhouses in medieval Europe were not just places to get clean, but lively social hubs where nearly everyone met, mingled, and occasionally overstepped the bounds of polite society. The more you dig, the clearer it gets that bathhouses were almost like medieval versions of cinemas, amusement parks, and coffee shops all rolled into one steamy, slightly scandalous package. Cities like Paris boasted dozens of bathhouses by the 13th century, often located near bakeries so they could share the heat from ovens. A clever bit of medieval engineering to keep water warm. It wasn't just water baths either. Some offered steam rooms, massages, shaves, and even medical treatments, like cupping therapy or blood, turning the bathhouse into a one-stop wellness center of sorts. Despite what you might think, the church's influence over bathhouse culture was complicated. On paper, Some clerics protested the public nudity and mixing of men and women, fearing moral decay. There are recorded edicts threatening fasting or penance for anyone caught bathing with members of the opposite sex, but enforcement was often lax. The public quite clearly enjoyed the bathhouse social scene too much, and authorities tended to overlook the illicit activities that sometimes took place. Local officials often saw bathhouses as ways to channel youthful energies harmlessly, rather than suppress them. The less glamorous side, bathhouses also had a reputation for prostitution and public sex. Bathhouses in London's Southwark, known as the Stews, were infamous for this. Prostitutes made bathhouses their workplace, and some were even licensed or protected by local authorities, an early and rather pragmatic regulation of sex work. By the 16th century, public bathhouses across Europe declined sharply. Was it the rise of puritanical moralism? The spread of new diseases like syphilis? Probably. But the Dutch philosopher Erasmus commented on this decline, lamenting the disappearance of fashionable public baths. Gradually, society started equating frequent bathing with immorality or disease, rather than cleanliness or socialization. Among the wealthy, bathing was still very much alive and well, often dripping in luxury. Royals and nobles took great pride in extravagant baths, sometimes bathing with a crowd of attendants or even other nobles in one giant tub. Charlemagne apparently hosted baths for over 100 people at once, which sounds more like a party than personal hygiene. Monasteries often maintained their own bathing routines as well, with monks sometimes required to bathe quarterly, despite some religious warnings against bodily indulgence. Abbeys with piped water and attendant bathers were status symbols among the pious elite. The common folk lacked the luxury of grand tubs, but weren't exactly bathing never types either. Ritual washing of hands, face, and feet was pervasive and essential to daily life. Herbal rinses, abrasive cloths, and early soaps scented with rosemary or lavender helped keep middling-class noses relatively fresh, despite the inevitable smells of urban life. Tooth care came too, with bits of twig used as primitive toothbrushes, and clove, or mint rinses, popular among those who could afford them. It was all an ongoing battle against body odors produced by crowded cities, rough clothing, open streets, and livestock freely mingling with humans. Perfumes and pomanders were also a key part of medieval sensory hygiene. People carried small balls filled with scented herbs to mask unpleasant smells and repel disease, carrying the aristocracy bathed in oils scented with rose, amber, or musk, and used scented gloves and handkerchiefs liberally. So medieval people's smell wasn't just stinky, it was a complex mixture of natural odors: wood smoke, animals, unpaved street sand, an impressive palette of flowers, herbs, perfumes, and soaps that balanced those base notes. Often, the societal rank was reflected by how elaborate or sophisticated one's personal scent was. In short, medieval hygiene and smell were far more nuanced than you might expect. Public bathhouses functioned both as health institutions and social nets. Perfumes and herbal concoctions masked potential odors, and daily washing rituals were norms rather than exceptions. Forget the Hollywood version of medieval folks as perpetually rat-infested creatures wandering endlessly in filth. That's more fantasy than fact, and a useful fantasy if you want easy villains or comic relief in films. The reality is far more interesting and a bit more nuanced. Take Queen Isabella of Castile, for instance. She supposedly bathed only twice in her life, once at birth and once on her wedding day. Sounds gross, right? But hold your judgment. Historical medical advice then warned against overbathing, fearing it could weaken the body by opening pores to disease. Not everyone followed the warning, though Isabella's daughter Juana bathed so often her husband feared she might get sick from it. Medieval medicine treated bathing as health maintenance. Sweat, dirt, and bodily secretions weren't just unpleasant, they were seen as potential carriers of illness. Doctors advised washing face, hands, and even mouths daily, often multiple times a day, for the wealthy to remove visible grime and invisible humors that supposedly disrupted internal balance. Monks and priests were hardly slobs either. Many maintained regular washing routines, and monasteries were often equipped with rudimentary plumbing for bathing and toilets. A far cry from the popular idea that holy men lived like animals. Some saints even embraced dirt to demonstrate humility and devotion, but that was exceptional, not the norm. So where did the myth of the dirty Middle Ages come from? A mix of Victorian-era prejudice wanting to present themselves as more civilized, some historical exaggerations, and the natural grime of pre-industrial life. Streets were unpaved, waste disposal primitive, and clothes weren't changed as often as today, but cleanliness was valued and pursued with the tools and knowledge available. Public bathhouses thrived across Europe, Paris, Prague, London, with people bathing regularly, sometimes daily, combining hygiene with socializing. They were centers of community life, places for relaxation, business, and gossip as much as washing. These communal baths also used herbs and perfumes to keep the air pleasant and mask odors. Nobles and royals often bathed lavishly herbal-infused waters. Perfumed oils and scented soaps made from animal fats and herbs were common. Bathing was a luxurious and sometimes political act, signaling wealth and refinement. The real smells of medieval life, likely a mixture of fragrant herbs, wood smoke, damp linen, and yes, occasional livestock odors. Medieval people managed their personal and public sense consciously, blending hygiene, health beliefs, and social status. So when imagining medieval people, don't default to stinky cavemen, but picture a complex world of baths, perfumes, daily washing rituals, and a surprisingly strong tradition of hygiene awareness. By the late medieval era, the bathhouse culture that once bubbled with life and laughter started to ebb. Why? The reasons are a tangled mix of fear, religion, and, oddly, emerging medical theories. The Black Death taught Europe a terrible lesson. Disease could travel unseen, and people began associating water itself with vulnerability. Doctors and surgeons warned that water opened pores and let harmful miasmas, bad air, into the body. That idea, combined with superstitions and puritanical religious fervor, fueled growing suspicion of frequent bathing. Public bathhouses, once thriving social hubs, came under attack. Moralists decried the mixed bathing and alleged licentious behavior. Authorities in London, Paris, and Spain issued bans or imposed stringent regulations, turning cuddly medieval spas into hotbeds of scandal waiting to be shut down. The rapid spread of syphilis from the late 15th century didn't help. This incredibly virulent disease made people wary of any hot spots of mingling, including baths, which could double as fronts for prostitution. Hysteria over contagion overshadowed centuries of successful hygiene practices. By the 16th century, many Europeans believed that bathing weakened the body, making it more susceptible to illness rather than protecting it. Public bathhouses closed, private baths diminished, and the rising fashion of layering more clothing and perfuming heavily, ironically, helped mask reduced washing. Royal hygiene followed suit. King Louis IX of France bathed only a couple of times a year, which didn't quite make him the poster child for cleanliness, but reflected the changing attitudes of his time. Nobility grew more invested in perfumes, powders, and elaborate clothing changes than in water baths. This long decline lasted until the 19th century, when industrialization, advances in medicine, and modern plumbing finally resurrected the bathing culture. What seemed to be a dark ages of filth was instead a complex, centuries-long shift in health theories and social norms. And modern media, well, that kept the bathless medieval myth alive, because it makes for easy stories and stark contrasts. The image of nobly stink-ridden peasants sells better than nuanced history. But historians today remind us to think more deeply and smell with fresh perspective. So, medieval people smelled of herbs, rosewater, wood smoke, sweat, and the vibrant life of bathhouses era. They washed, they perfumed, they managed their odors thoughtfully. The real stench was in the air of fear and misunderstanding about disease and morality, not everyday life. Next time someone tells you medieval hygiene was non-existent, smile and remember the soft murmur of bathhouse gossip, the prickly scold of monks scrubbing clean, and the herbal cocktails that perfumed the streets of a washing Europe. That is the reality behind medieval smells: complex, fragrant, and far from foul.